Washington, D.C., early 1960s. A plain white van sits across from a quiet park near the Soviet embassy. Inside, 3 CIA officers wait without speaking. Radios are tuned, headphones are ready. Every movement is controlled. On the floor between them sits a gray and white cat. Across the park, 2 Soviet officials lean toward each other on a wooden bench. They chose this spot carefully. No walls, no ceilings, no hidden microphones. The open air feels safe. For years, American intelligence tried to penetrate that embassy. They failed. The building was sealed. The guards were disciplined. Every human approach was noticed. So the CIA decided to remove the human element entirely. They built a spy that no one would suspect. 5 years of research, custom-built transmitters, a microphone implanted inside an ear canal, a wire threaded along a spine to turn a tail into a living antenna, a miniature power source sealed inside a body. Nearly $20 million invested in one experiment. The van door cracks open. Fresh air drifts inside. One officer lifts the cat gently and steps out toward the edge of the park. The Soviets are still talking. Close enough now. This is the moment the operation was designed for. If it works, the CIA will hear conversations they were never meant to hear. If it fails, years of innovation collapse in seconds. The cat is placed on the pavement. It pauses, looks around, and then it makes a decision no engineer could predict. In less than 10 minutes, the most expensive intelligence experiment in CIA history will be over. Not because the Soviets detected it, not because the technology malfunctioned, but because nature does not follow orders. This is the story of Operation Acoustic Kitty, a mission that proved you can engineer machines, but you cannot engineer instinct. If you're interested in the hidden stories behind Cold War intelligence and the operations that shaped history, subscribe now. We uncover the missions that were never meant to be seen.
The Cold War was not just a battle of weapons, it was a battle of information. By the early 1960s, Washington and Moscow were locked in a permanent state of suspicion. Nuclear war was no longer theoretical. Both sides possessed the ability to destroy entire cities within minutes. In that environment, intelligence was not optional. It was survival. Every conversation mattered. The Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C. quickly became one of the most difficult targets in the American intelligence network. The building was constructed like a fortress. Thick walls, controlled access, internal security sweeps conducted regularly. Soviet counterintelligence officers assumed every American technician, every repair crew, every delivery was a potential threat. Planting listening devices inside the embassy proved nearly impossible. Even when attempts were made, they were often discovered during routine inspections. The Soviets expected walls to be bugged. They expected phones to be tapped. They expected human surveillance. So they adapted. When discussions turned sensitive, officers did not remain inside. They walked. There was a small park across the street from the embassy. Open space, benches, trees. No ceilings to hide microphones. No fixed structure to wire. In theory, it was the safest place available. If someone sat too close, the conversation stopped. If a stranger lingered, they moved. Anyone who appeared out of place was noted. From a counterintelligence perspective, it was simple and effective. Remove the walls, remove the bugs. For the CIA, it created a strategic nightmare. Human surveillance teams could follow, but proximity meant exposure. A man reading a newspaper too near the bench would draw attention. A parked vehicle with obvious equipment risked detection. Long-range microphones were unreliable in open air. Traffic noise interfered. Wind distorted sound. Even when partial recordings were captured, they were often unusable. The problem was not technology alone. It was physics. Sound dissipates. Conversations in open environments do not travel cleanly over distance. To hear clearly, you must be close. To be close, you must be unnoticed. And that was the paradox. Inside the CIA's Office of Research and Development, analysts began framing the issue differently. Instead of asking how to improve microphones or how to disguise human agents, they asked a more radical question. What if the collector of information was something no one ever suspects? The Cold War rewarded unconventional thinking. This was the era of experimental aircraft, early satellites, and covert operations that blurred ethical boundaries. Billions of dollars flowed into projects that promised even marginal advantages. Failure was tolerated, sometimes even expected, if the potential payoff was significant enough. The logic was brutal but clear. If a single intercepted conversation could prevent a strategic miscalculation, then extraordinary measures were justified. Desperation does not always look dramatic. It often looks methodical. Engineers studied environmental patterns around the embassy, pedestrian movement, traffic flow, the behavior of diplomats. They analyzed how often Soviet officers used the park and how long they typically remained seated. They measured average speaking volume under outdoor conditions. They calculated distance to clarity ratios for existing audio equipment. Every conclusion led back to the same constraint. The device had to be within a few meters of the target. Not 20 meters, not 10, closer. But nothing mechanical could move naturally through a public park without drawing notice. A visible robot would be absurd. A planted object would be examined. A disguised human would be scrutinized. They needed something that belonged in that environment. Something that could wander, something small. Something invisible not because it was hidden, but because it was ordinary. This was not a technological challenge at first, it was a behavioral one. The CIA did not lack microphones. It lacked proximity without suspicion. And somewhere inside that strategic dead end, an idea began forming. An idea that would blur the line between engineering and biology, between innovation and hubris. Because if humans were the problem, perhaps humans should not be part of the solution at all. The proposal did not begin as a joke. Inside a secure conference room, engineers and analysts reviewed the same conclusion again and again: proximity without suspicion. Every mechanical option failed under scrutiny. Every human option increased exposure. Then someone reframed the question: what moves freely in a public park without attracting attention? Not a device, not a vehicle, not a person. An animal. At first, the idea sounded impractical. Animals are unpredictable. They cannot be briefed. They cannot be reasoned with. But the Cold War was not an era that dismissed radical concepts easily. If satellites could be launched into orbit and planes could fly at 3 times the speed of sound, why not rethink surveillance itself? The team began evaluating possibilities. Birds were rejected quickly. They could fly away. They could not be directed with precision. Dogs were too visible. People noticed dogs. They pet them. they talked to their owners. A dog lingering near a diplomatic conversation would invite interaction. But cats were different. Cats exist in public spaces without explanation. They wander, they pause, they sit near strangers without asking permission. They do not require handlers standing nearby. They are independent by nature. Most importantly, no one suspects a cat. The more the team examined the behavior patterns, the more the concept made a certain cold sense. If a cat could approach within a few meters of two-seated individuals, it would not appear threatening. It would not trigger counter-surveillance instincts. It would simply be ignored. Ignored proximity was exactly what the CIA needed. But proximity alone was not enough. The cat would not carry a visible recording device. It could not wear equipment. The solution had to be invisible. So the project moved from behavioral theory to technical reality. The CIA's Office of Research and Development initiated a classified program. Its objective was simple to state and extraordinarily difficult to execute. Integrate surveillance technology into a living animal without altering its outward appearance.
Observe the pattern. It is evolving.
This was not improvisation. It became a structured research initiative involving veterinarians, surgeons, electronics engineers, and radio specialists. Each discipline confronted a version of the same constraint: miniaturization. In the early 1960s, electronic components were not small by modern standards. Microphones were bulky, transmitters required significant power, batteries were heavy. To embed such equipment into an animal required redesigning each component from the ground up. The first requirement was an audio receiver small enough to fit inside the ear canal without impairing natural hearing. It had to capture human speech clearly while filtering environmental noise, wind, distant traffic, ambient sounds. It also had to operate continuously without overheating or causing infection. Next came transmission. Captured audio would be useless without a reliable wireless link back to surveillance receivers inside a nearby vehicle. The transmitter had to be powerful enough to send a clean signal over distance, yet compact enough to remain concealed within tissue. Engineers experimented with custom circuitry. They reduced component size. They tested signal stability in urban conditions. They faced the persistent problem of power supply. Every gram added weight. Every wire introduced risk. Then came the antenna. Traditional antennas were visible structures. That was unacceptable. The design had to exploit the animal's own anatomy. A conductive filament, thinner than human hair, was developed. It could be threaded along the spine and integrated into the tail, allowing the tail's natural movement to assist in signal transmission. What emerged was not simply a device placed on an animal. It was a biological electronic hybrid. The estimated costs rose steadily. Research, testing, surgical development, specialized materials. Millions were allocated without public knowledge. But within the internal logic of Cold War strategy, the price was justified. If the project succeeded, it would redefine field surveillance. The plan was approved. Not because it was conventional, but because it might work. The final step was selecting the subject, a healthy stray cat that would become the center of one of the most ambitious and controversial intelligence experiments ever attempted. The technology was nearly ready. The question that remained was far more unpredictable. Could a living creature be transformed into an instrument without ceasing to behave like itself? Designing the technology was one thing. Putting it inside a living body was something else entirely. The CIA secured a controlled veterinary facility for the procedure. This was not an ordinary clinic. Access was restricted. Personnel were cleared. The operation was classified at every level. Surgeons reviewed anatomical diagrams repeatedly. Engineers stood by with modified components. Nothing about this had precedent. The objective was surgical invisibility. The microphone would be placed where sound naturally entered the body, the ear canal. It had to sit deep enough to capture clear speech, but not so deep that it interfered with hearing or caused permanent damage. The incision had to be minimal, the placement exact. Once implanted, the device would connect to micro-wiring that ran beneath the skin toward the transmitter. Next came the transmitter itself. A pocket of space was created at the base of the skull, where bone and muscle offered relative protection. The transmitter, custom-built and reduced to the smallest possible size, was secured there. Connections were tested repeatedly before closure. If a wire shifted even slightly, the entire system would fail. The most delicate stage followed. The antenna wire had to run the length of the spine and into the tail. Surgeons made a series of tiny incisions along the back, threading the filament carefully through tissue without disturbing nerves or muscle integrity. A single error could paralyze the animal. Precision was not optional. The tail became more than anatomy. It became part of the transmission system. Finally, the power source was implanted within the torso. Its placement had to balance weight distribution, minimize discomfort, and prevent chemical leakage. The battery was designed specifically for this operation: small, sealed, durable. Engineers calculated how long it could operate continuously before depletion. The surgery lasted hours. When it ended, the cat appeared unchanged. Fur concealed the incisions. The body showed no obvious alteration. To an observer, it was simply an animal. But beneath the skin lay a network of components that had cost millions to design. Recovery took weeks. Veterinarians monitored healing. Engineers tested signal strength in controlled environments. Audio clarity was measured and adjusted. Transmissions were received and analyzed from varying distances. Wind simulations were conducted. Background noise was introduced deliberately to refine filtering capacity. At one point, infection risk nearly compromised the experiment. Antibiotic regimens were adjusted. Equipment was recalibrated. The team persisted. Eventually, the system stabilized. The signal transmitted clearly within operational range. Conversations spoken at moderate volume could be detected. The hardware functioned as intended. Technologically, the project was a success. It proved that miniaturized surveillance components could be integrated into a living organism without immediate rejection. It demonstrated innovation that was, for its time, extraordinary. But success in a laboratory is not success in the field. The machine inside the cat worked. The question was whether the cat would. Because no amount of engineering could alter one fundamental reality. The body now carried advanced electronics. The mind still belonged to a cat. And that difference would soon become the most expensive oversight of the entire operation. With the technology operational, the CIA faced a challenge that had nothing to do with electronics: control. The cat could transmit audio. The signal was stable. Receivers inside a nearby vehicle could capture and record conversations clearly within range. But surveillance is not just about hearing. It is about positioning. If the cat failed to approach the target, the equipment inside it was irrelevant. A controlled training environment was constructed. Artificial park benches were installed. Actors were assigned roles as Soviet officers. Trainers attempted to condition the animal to move toward a specific location and remain there long enough to capture usable audio. The objective was simple: walk toward the bench, sit, stay. In theory, this required only mild conditioning. In practice, it exposed the flaw in the entire operation. Cats do not respond to structured commands with reliability. Unlike dogs, they do not possess strong pack obedience instincts. They respond to environment, curiosity, hunger, comfort. The first weeks produced inconsistent results. Sometimes the cat moved toward the designated location. Other times it stopped midway and lay down. Occasionally, it ignored the target completely, distracted by movement or sound outside the test parameters. Food incentives were introduced. Placement timing was adjusted. Environmental distractions were minimized. Progress was measured statistically. Under near-perfect conditions, the cat approached the target zone approximately 40% of the time. 40%. In intelligence operations, that margin is not comfortable. It is unstable. Still, the sunk cost weighed heavily on decision makers. Millions had already been spent. Years of research had been invested. Abandoning the project at this stage would mean admitting that the premise itself was flawed. So expectations shifted. Instead of demanding precision, planners recalibrated their objective. The cat did not need to sit exactly between the two Soviet officers. It simply needed to be within audio range for several minutes. Perhaps it did not require discipline. Perhaps proximity alone was sufficient. Field simulations were expanded. Trainers introduced environmental variables, unexpected noises, mild movement, urban sound patterns. The cat's response remained unpredictable. On some days, it moved directly toward the actors. On others, it climbed nearby structures or wandered off course entirely. From a behavioral standpoint, the conclusion was clear. The cat could not be guaranteed to perform. From a bureaucratic standpoint, the conclusion was more complicated. The hardware worked. The signal transmitted. The objective remained vital. So planners made a decision that would define the mission. They accepted risk. If the cat could achieve proximity even part of the time, then a real-world deployment might still produce valuable intelligence. Intelligence operations rarely operate at 100% certainty. Imperfect tools are sometimes used when no better option exists. Confidence did not drive the approval. Momentum did. 5 years of development had created institutional gravity. The operation had a name. Funding had been justified. Reports had been written. It was time to test it outside controlled conditions. Because simulations could only reveal so much, the real question was not whether the system worked in theory, it was what would happen when instinct encountered reality. And that answer was waiting in a quiet park across from the Soviet embassy. You have already seen the van. You have already seen the agents. What you have not seen yet is the moment when engineering collided with unpredictability. Deployment was scheduled. The cat would be released. And the Cold War would briefly depend on whether nature could be persuaded to cooperate. You have seen preparation. Now comes exposure. In less than 10 minutes, the cost of that decision would become undeniable. The van engine was off. Inside, the air felt heavier than it should have. 3 officers monitored equipment that represented years of classified effort. Headphones were adjusted. Signal strength was checked again. A faint hum confirmed that the transmitter inside the animal was active. Across the park, the 2 Soviet officials remained seated. Their posture was relaxed. From a distance, nothing about the scene suggested significance. To any passerby, it was an ordinary weekday conversation. To the CIA, it was a test of whether biology could be directed like machinery. One officer studied the distance through binoculars, approximately 50 meters, within potential range. The cat did not need to reach the bench precisely. It only needed to enter the perimeter where speech could be captured. The van door opened slightly. Fresh air entered the compartment. Urban noise followed. Cars in motion, distant footsteps, the low rustle of wind through trees. The cat's ears rotated toward the soundscape. The officer holding it stepped out carefully, moving toward the park entrance. He avoided sudden motion. Nothing about his body language suggested urgency. This was meant to look natural. He reached the edge of the grass and lowered the animal to the pavement. The cat paused. Its body remained still for a moment, processing new stimuli. The officer stepped back and returned to the van without hesitation. Inside, silence returned. Every eye focused on the windshield. The cat stood. It stretched. Then it began walking. At first, its direction appeared neutral, slightly angled toward the park. One officer leaned forward, tracking movement with cautious optimism. If it continued, it might intersect the trajectory of the bench. But instinct does not operate on strategic maps. Halfway across the pavement, the cat's head turned. Something else had drawn its attention. Perhaps a sound. Perhaps motion. Perhaps nothing identifiable at all. It adjusted course, not toward the Soviet agents, toward the street. Inside the van, tension shifted from anticipation to concern. The cat approached the curb. It did not hesitate. There was no training for traffic awareness, no conditioning for vehicles. The animal moved forward as it would in any other environment, curious, unburdened by consequence. A taxi was approaching at normal speed. The officers saw it immediately. Distance calculations began instinctively. Could the driver see the animal? Would he slow down? Should someone intervene? They could not. Any sudden movement from the van would compromise the operation entirely. Years of secrecy would evaporate in seconds. The mission depended on invisibility. The taxi continued forward. The cat stepped into the roadway. There was no dramatic pause, no warning. Impact was immediate. The vehicle did not stop. It did not swerve. It continued down the street as though nothing unusual had occurred. Inside the van, no one spoke. 5 years of development, surgical integration of advanced electronics, millions in research funding, 10 minutes into field deployment. The operation ended not through counterintelligence detection, not through technological malfunction, but through randomness. Across the park, the Soviet officials remained seated. They had not noticed. Their conversation continued uninterrupted. The surveillance receivers inside the van carried no voices, only silence. After several seconds, one officer exhaled slowly. The others remained fixed on the windshield, processing the abrupt finality of what had just happened. They could not retrieve the body without raising questions. They could not dismantle the equipment. The most advanced components of the project now lay exposed on a public street, dependent on chance for disposal. The van engine started. The vehicle pulled away. Behind them, the most expensive experimental intelligence platform in agency history lay motionless. The mission report would later list technical evaluations and procedural notes. It would analyze variables and reconsider feasibility. But the essential conclusion was simpler. The hardware functioned, The concept did not. Because engineering can reduce size, it can improve signal clarity, it can miniaturize transmitters, but it cannot override instinct. And instinct does not obey command structures. The Cold War would continue. Surveillance methods would evolve. But Operation Acoustic Kitty would stand as a reminder that not every problem yields to innovation. Some fail because they misunderstand the nature of what they are trying to control. The CIA learned that lesson in less than 10 minutes, and it cost $20 million. Back at headquarters, the report did not begin with drama. It began with facts: deployment time, signal status, environmental conditions, cause of termination. The technical summary was almost clinical. The implanted microphone had functioned correctly. Transmission quality prior to impact was stable. Power levels were within operational range. There was no hardware malfunction. From an engineering standpoint, the system had performed as designed. The failure occurred in the uncontrolled variable, the subject. Internal reviews followed. Analysts examined training data. They re-evaluated probability models. Could adjustments improve behavioral reliability? Could conditioning protocols be refined? Could future subjects be selected differently? The deeper they examined the project, the clearer the pattern became. Every stage of development had assumed that unpredictability could be reduced enough to be operationally acceptable. Not eliminated, just reduced. But the deployment demonstrated something uncomfortable. Unpredictability had not been reduced. It had simply been postponed. The Cold War rewarded ambition. It encouraged innovation at the edge of possibility. Intelligence agencies across the world experimented constantly. New materials, new surveillance techniques, new delivery systems. Operation Acoustic Kitty fit that culture perfectly. It was bold, creative, technically impressive. It was also a miscalculation of control. The agency eventually terminated the program. Official documentation concluded that animals were unsuitable for precise surveillance missions. The unpredictability of instinct outweighed the sophistication of the technology. The project faded into classified archives. Years later, when fragments of the story surfaced, it was often retold as comedy. A bizarre anecdote from a paranoid era, a punchline about government excess. But the reality was more instructive than humorous. The project revealed how far institutions are willing to go when information equals survival. It showed how logic, when extended under pressure, can drift into extremes that appear rational only within their own internal framework. The CIA did not build the operation because it was foolish. It built it because the strategic problem felt unsolvable by ordinary means. And when ordinary tools fail, extraordinary ideas emerge. Some of those ideas change history. Others expose the limits of human control. Operation Acoustic Kitty belonged to the second category. The lesson was not that technology fails. The lesson was that technology cannot rewrite nature. You can implant circuitry, you can engineer transmitters, you can miniaturize microphones, but you cannot command instinct to align with mission objectives. In the end, the most expensive failure in CIA history was not about a cat. It was about the assumption that complexity guarantees control. It does not. And that realization cost $20 million. This story is not about ridicule. It is about the boundary between innovation and overreach. A boundary the Cold War forced governments to test repeatedly. Sometimes, that boundary pushed back. Operation Acoustic Kitty ended in under 10 minutes. Its warning lasted much longer. If this story surprised you, share it with someone who thinks intelligence agencies never make mistakes. Subscribe for more untold operations from the Cold War and beyond. History is not just victories. Sometimes it's the failures that teach the most.